The dust tasted of indifference. It coated the back of her throat, a fine grit that was the same color as the parched timber of the station platform, the same color as the faces that passed without seeing. She had been there 3 days. The sun had branded the hours onto the raw skin of her shoulders, visible through the rips in her dress. Her feet, bare against the splintered planks, were numb to everything but the deep, resonant vibration of a train that was not coming for her. She sat on a small, worn burlap sack that held everything she had not lost. Her mother's shawl, a tin cup, a wooden bird with one wing snapped off. She held her body still, a stillness learned from things that break if they move too much. Her gaze was fixed on the far point where the iron rails melted into the shimmering heat of the plains. That was where the world ended. That was where her mother's waiting had ended. The town moved around her like a slow river around a stone. Women with baskets pulled their children closer, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Men in dusty hats slowed their pace, their eyes lingering with a vacant curiosity or a flicker of something uglier, something that assessed her worth in livestock or labor. She was a fixture now, a piece of station refuse, a problem someone would eventually have to solve. The station master, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, had tried. His voice was slick with false pity. He had offered her a stale biscuit the first day, his fingers brushing her arm for a moment too long. She had not taken it. The second day, he had offered work in the back rooms of the saloon, a suggestion that hung in the air like sour smoke. She had not answered. Today, his patience had curdled. He stood before her now, blocking the unforgiving sun, casting her in a thick, impatient shadow. "This ain't a charity, girl. You can't just sit here and rot." His words were for the small audience that had gathered. A pair of ranchers, a freight handler, a woman with a sour face who sold withered-looking pies. The girl did not look up. She traced a crack in the floorboards with her eyes. It ran from the station master's boot all the way to the edge of the platform, an escape route to nowhere. "I got a man, Finch, up at the copper mine," the station master continued, his voice taking on the oily tone of a salesman. "He needs a cook, cleaner. Not particular about much, so long as she's quiet." He nudged her sack with the toe of his boot. "He'll take you off my hands. Consider it a favor." The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The crowd watched. This was the solving of the problem. This was the sweeping away of the refuse. Her stillness was an answer they refused to hear. She was simply an object being bartered. From the edge of the small crowd, a man stepped forward. He moved with a quiet economy, as if he begrudged the air for the space he took up. He was tall, thin as a fence rail, and carried whole winters in his eyes. Dust clung to his worn coat like a second skin. He had been there all 3 days, leaning against a support beam in the shade, watching not her, but the horizon, as if he too were waiting for something that would never arrive. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not on the station master, but on her. It was a strange look, not of pity or of want, but of quiet acknowledgement, as if he were looking at a reflection in a muddy puddle. The station master turned, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Elias? This ain't your business." Elias's eyes, the color of a washed-out winter sky, finally moved to the station master. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding under a slow river. "What debt does Finch owe you?" The station master blinked, thrown off. "What? That's between me and him. I'll settle it," Elias said. The words were flat, a statement of fact. He reached into his coat, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and shook 3 silver coins into his palm. They were dull, worn smooth with use. He held them out. "This cover it." The station master stared at the coins, then at Elias's face. Greed warred with suspicion. "For her? She ain't worth that." "That's my business," Elias said, his voice unchanging. "Does this settle Finch's debt?" A greedy light flickered in the station master's eyes. He snatched the coins, his fleshy palm closing over them like a trap. The debt is settled. She's your problem now. He turned and walked away, the small crowd dissolving with him, their brief moment of entertainment over. The dust settled. The heat beat down. It was just the two of them on the platform, surrounded by the vast, open silence of the plains. He did not move closer. He stood there, a sentinel carved from hardship, his shadow falling near her but not touching her. After a long moment, a sound escaped her, thin and cracked from disuse. Mama died waiting at that station. It was not an explanation. It was a stone dropped into a deep well, and she did not know why she had thrown it. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze on the iron rails. He seemed to understand the grammar of loss. He took a step forward, bent down, and picked up the burlap sack from beside her. His knuckles were chapped and scarred. He held the bag as if it weighed more than it should. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond the winter in his eyes. A flicker of old embers, banked but not extinguished. He whispered, the sound meant only for her, a promise against the dry wind. You won't. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed. He did not command her, did not claim her with a hand on her arm. He simply walked away from the station, carrying her bag, leaving the choice to her, to remain a stone on the riverbank, or to be swept up in this new, uncertain current. Her feet remembered how to move before her mind did. She pushed herself up from the splintered wood, the world tilting for a dizzying second. She took one step, then another, following the straight, lonely line of his back as he walked away from the place where waiting ended. The journey to his homestead was a long, silent conversation. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry earth, the sighing of the wind through the sparse, skeletal brush, and the distant cry of a hawk circling in an ocean of pale blue sky. He walked a few paces ahead, a steady, unyielding rhythm. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every footstep. His pace was measured, slow enough that she did not have to struggle to keep up. The sun was a merciless hammer. After an hour, the world began to waver at the edges. She felt the strength draining from her legs, her bare feet raw against the hot, sharp ground. He stopped, not because he was tired, but because he had heard the subtle change in her breathing, the slight falter in her step. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and set it on a flat rock between them. He did not speak. He just walked a little ways off and stood with his back to her, looking out over the endless expanse of brown and gold. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps just profound weariness. He was giving her space to be weak without being watched. She knelt, her hands trembling as she unscrewed the cap. The water was warm, tasting of metal and dust, but it was the first true kindness she had known in a lifetime that felt measured in days. She drank slowly, carefully, not taking too much. She screwed the cap back on, her fingers tracing the dents in the tin. When she looked up, he was still facing away, a lonely figure against the vast emptiness. She left the canteen on the rock and stood, waiting. He turned, retrieved the canteen without a word, and they walked on. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of that simple act, a shared drink of water in a thirsty land. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and bruised purple across the horizon. The homestead was carved into the land, not built upon it. It was a small, sod-roofed cabin, its timber walls weathered to the color of old bone. A ramshackle barn leaned tiredly to one side, and a few crooked fence posts marked out a patch of ground where nothing grew but stubborn weeds. A single, stark grave lay on a small rise, marked by a plain wooden cross. The place felt like him. Solitary, stoic, and haunted by a quiet sorrow. The wind turned mean as the light failed, whispering through the cracks in the walls, a lonely, keening sound. He pushed open the heavy plank door, which scraped against the floor. He stepped inside and lit a lantern. The light bloomed, pushing back the shadows, revealing a room that was stark and spare. There was a stone hearth, cold and black. A rough-hewn table with one chair, a narrow cot against one wall, a single blanket folded neatly upon it. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dust, and something else, the faint, lingering memory of absence. He gestured toward the table. Sit. She remained by the door, her hand still on the cold iron latch, the instinct to flee a living thing inside her. The cabin felt too small, too enclosed. A trap. He seemed to understand. He didn't press. Instead, he moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flame sputtered, then caught on the kindling he had laid. Firelight flickered, painting the room in dancing shades of orange and black. The warmth began to push back the chill. He set a pot of water over the fire, then took out a small sack of cornmeal and a piece of salted pork. He worked with a practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. He was not making a meal for a guest. He was performing a chore, one he had clearly done alone 1,000 times. When the food was ready, a simple, lumpy porridge, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one on the table, then took the other and sat on his cot, leaving the single chair for her. Another choice, another offering of space. She moved slowly, hesitantly, to the table and sat down. The wood of the chair was smooth with age. She picked up the spoon. The porridge was hot, salty, and substantial. It was the first real food she had eaten in days. She ate without looking at him, focusing on the scrape of the spoon against the bowl, the comforting heat spreading through her belly. When she was finished, he took her empty bowl without a word and set it aside. He pointed to a small door at the back of the cabin. That room. It's empty. You can sleep there. She looked at the door, then back at him. Her throat was tight. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Locks, doors, enclosed spaces. He read the terror in her eyes. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. I don't lock doors, he said, his voice quiet but steady. Not ever. He stood, walked to the main door, and pushed it slightly ajar, letting in a thin slice of the cold night air and the sound of the ceaseless wind. He was showing her. The way out was always there. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She rose from the chair and walked to the small room. Pushing the door open, she saw it was just as he said. Empty. A small, high window showed a sliver of starry sky. There was a pile of clean, soft blankets on the floor. It was more than she could have hoped for. She did not close the door all the way. She left it cracked open, a mirror of the front door, a silent acknowledgement of his promise. She lay down on the blankets, pulling one over her, the coarse wool smelling of cedar and cold air. Through the crack in the door, she could see him sitting on his cot, staring into the dying flames of the fire, a man keeping watch over a house full of ghosts. For the first time since her mother's last breath, she felt the possibility of safety. It was a fragile thing, thin as a spider's thread, but it was there. And in the deep, quiet dark of that borrowed room, she slept. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the land. A routine stitched their lives together with raw, unspoken thread. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm clock. He would tend to the 2 gaunt chickens in their coop and the old mule that watched the world with weary, knowing eyes. He worked the ungiving earth, mending fences that sagged with exhaustion, reinforcing the barn against a wind that was always trying to tear it down. She began to inhabit the small spaces he left for her. At first, she only swept the floor of the cabin, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a small, steady sound against the great silence. She washed their 2 bowls and 2 spoons, setting them to dry on a clean cloth. They were small acts, offerings left on an altar of shared space. He never commented, but she would notice he left the broom where it was easier for her to reach, or that a fresh bar of soap had appeared by the water basin. She found his wife's garden, a ghost of a place behind the cabin. It was choked with weeds, the soil cracked and dry, but the faint outlines of old rows were still visible. A few hardy herbs had survived, clinging to life with a desperate tenacity. She began to pull the weeds, her fingers raw from the stubborn roots. It was mindless work, grounding work. It was a way to care for something that was not herself. One afternoon, he came back from the fence line to find her kneeling in the dirt, her face smudged, her hands caked with earth. He stopped and watched her for a long moment. She did not notice him. He turned and went into the barn, returning with a small, rusty trowel. He set it on the ground beside her, a few feet from her hand, and then walked away. She stared at the tool, its wooden handle worn smooth by another woman's hands. She picked it up. It fit her palm perfectly. They rarely spoke. Words felt like clumsy, heavy things in the delicate quiet they had built. Their communication was a language of objects and actions. A bucket of clean water left by the door. A bowl of porridge that was a little less salty. A freshly baked loaf of bread on the table, hers, dense and slightly burned on the bottom. He picked up a piece, broke it and chewed it thoughtfully. He swallowed. "A little dry," he said, his voice rusty. She froze, her heart hammering. Criticism. He met her eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "You didn't complain about mine." It was not a joke, not quite. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a tiny crack in the stoic facade. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. That night, she noticed he had eaten every last crumb. One evening, a storm rolled in, a great, bruised belly of a cloud that swallowed the sky. Rain came down not in drops but in sheets, turning the world outside into a churning gray chaos. The wind howled, rattling the door in its frame, clawing at the roof. He brought in extra wood for the fire, his coat dripping water onto the floor. The cabin, which had once felt like a trap, now felt like a sanctuary. The fire roared in the hearth, a defiant heart against the storm's fury. He sat on his cot, mending a piece of leather harness, his brow furrowed in concentration. She sat in the chair, darning one of his worn shirts, the needle a tiny silver fish swimming through the coarse fabric. The storm worsened. A crack of thunder, sharp and violent, shook the very foundations of the cabin. She flinched, dropping the needle. A memory, swift and brutal, flashed behind her eyes. A man's angry shout, the sound of a door splintering. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to tremble. He stopped his work. He didn't look at her, but he was aware of the change in her, the sudden tension that had filled the small space between them. He set the harness aside. "The roof is strong," he said, his voice low and calm, a steady rock in the turbulent noise. "I built it to hold." It wasn't just the roof he was talking about. She knew it. She looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were strong hands, capable hands. They had settled a debt, carried her bag, offered her water, left her a tool in a dead garden. They had never once been raised in anger. She took a shaky breath, the fear receding like a spent wave. She picked up the shirt and the needle, her fingers still clumsy. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why did you take me?" He was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. The flames cast shadows that danced on his weathered face, making it impossible to read. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "She was a kind woman. She would have." He said nothing more. He did not need to. In those few words, he had laid a ghost to rest and planted a seed. He was not just honoring a memory. He was allowing a new thing to grow in the space grief had left behind. He was tending to her because his wife would have, but he was also, she realized, tending to himself. She looked down at the shirt in her lap, at the neat, small stitches she was making, closing a hole, making something whole again. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the silence that returned was deep and peaceful, a shared blanket against the cold. The first sign of trouble was a flicker of unnatural light on the horizon, just after sunset. It was not the soft glow of a homesteader's lantern, but a pulsing, angry orange that stained the bruised twilight sky. Elias saw it from the edge of his property, where he was checking a trap line. He stood still for a long time, his face hardening into a granite mask. The wind carried a faint, acrid smell. Smoke. He returned to the cabin not with his usual measured pace, but with a grim urgency. He did not speak when he entered. He went straight to a loose floorboard beneath his cot, pried it up and pulled out a long, heavy rifle, wrapped in oilcloth. He began cleaning it with a methodical, terrifying calm. She watched him from the doorway of her small room, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She knew. The world they had built in this small, quiet pocket of the plains was fragile. The outside world, with its loud claims and casual cruelty, had found them. The next day, 2 riders appeared, small black specks crawling across the vast landscape. They grew larger, resolving into men on horseback. One was the station master, his bulk spilling over the sides of his saddle. The other was a man she did not know, but he had the same look as the station master, a smug, proprietary confidence. This was Finch. Elias met them at the edge of his property, by the crooked fence line. He held the rifle loosely in the crook of his arm, its presence a simple, undeniable fact. She watched from the cabin doorway, her body rigid, the rusty trowel clutched in her hand. Her garden, their garden, was behind her. This was her ground. "Elias," the station master called out, his voice trying for a friendly tone that didn't reach his eyes. "We've just come for a chat." "State your business," Elias said. His voice was flat, carrying no warmth, no welcome. Finch, a man with a florid face and small, mean eyes, urged his horse forward. "My business is her," he said, nodding toward the cabin, toward her. "You settled a debt for me, and I thank you for it. But the girl was part of a different arrangement. She was promised to me, for labor at my mine." He smiled, a greasy, unpleasant thing. "I've come to collect my property." The word hung in the air. Property. It was the same word that had been used at the station, a word that stripped her of name, of flesh, of soul. It was a brand. Elias did not move. His gaze was fixed on Finch. "She is not property. She lives here." Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Lives here? You're harboring stolen goods, Elias. The law would see it that way. I have witnesses. She was abandoned. I made a claim." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "Look, I'm a reasonable man. I'll pay you back your 3 coins. We can forget this whole thing. Just give her over. A man like you has no use for a stray like that anyway." She saw Elias's knuckles turn white where he gripped the rifle stock. The air grew tight, vibrating with a tension that was about to snap. She thought he would raise the gun. She thought there would be violence, a terrible, final noise that would shatter their quiet world forever. But he didn't. He just stood there, a bulwark of quiet refusal.
"No. No."
Finch's face darkened. "That's your final word? Over a worthless, mute little scrap?" Before Elias could answer, a voice, clear and steady, cut through the tense air. "My name is Lena." The words came from her. They felt strange in her own mouth, new and powerful. She had not known her name until she said it. It was as if the saying of it created it. All 3 men turned to look at her. Finch's jaw went slack with surprise. The station master looked uneasy. Elias's face remained impassive, but she saw a flicker, a barest hint of something, in the depths of his winter eyes. She took a step forward, out of the shadow of the doorway and into the stark sunlight. She held up the trowel. It was not a weapon, not really. It was a symbol, a tool for tending, for nurturing, for making things grow. It was a claim. "This is my home," she said, her voice stronger now. She looked directly at Finch, her gaze unwavering. "You are not welcome here." Finch stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. This was not the broken, silent thing he had come to collect. This was someone else entirely. He was a man who understood force and fear, but this quiet, defiant strength was a language he did not speak. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's unmoving form, to the long, dark barrel of the rifle that was not pointed at him but was present all the same. He saw two people, not one man and a piece of property. He saw a wall he could not break. He was a blusterer, a coward at his core. Without an easy victim, his resolve crumbled. With a guttural curse, he wrenched his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. "This isn't over," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. The station master, looking pale and sweating, wasted no time in following. They rode away, their backs radiating defeat, the dust lifting behind them like angry ghosts. She stood there, trembling now that the danger was past, the trowel still held tightly in her hand. Elias walked slowly back toward her. He stopped in front of her, his tall frame blocking the harsh afternoon sun. He looked down at the trowel she was clutching, then up at her face. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently take the tool from her hand. His fingers brushed hers for a fleeting second. It was the first time they had touched. He looked at her, his eyes holding a depth of emotion she could not yet name, but it felt like reverence. "Lena," he said, tasting the name. "It's a good name." He turned and placed the trowel by the cabin door, where it belonged. The threat was gone. The silence that descended was not empty or tense. It was clean. It was whole. It was the sound of a foundation settling, strong and deep. That night, after the thin meal they shared in their usual quiet, he did not go to his cot. He added another log to the fire, watching the new flames catch and roar to life. The air in the cabin was still, holding the echo of the day's confrontation. "I was scared," she said, her voice small in the vast quiet. He nodded, his eyes on the fire. "I know," he paused, then added, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "So was I." It was a confession, a gift of vulnerability that was more precious than any coin. He looked at her then, across the dancing firelight. "You didn't run." "Neither did you," she replied. A simple truth, a vow exchanged without ceremony. He rose and went to the small, empty room where she slept. He returned with the pile of soft blankets. He did not ask. He laid them out on the floor near the hearth, on the opposite side from his cot, in the warm circle of the fire's glow. An invitation, an unspoken acknowledgement that the need for separate, guarded spaces was over. She left her chair and sat on the blankets, pulling one around her shoulders. He returned to his cot. They sat there for a long time, two quiet figures sharing the same fire, the same silence, the same home. The wind outside could no longer sound menacing. It was just the wind. The house, their house, breathed a deep, slow, contented sigh around them. In the days that followed, something fundamental shifted. The routines remained, the chores, the mending, the tending of the garden. But they were no longer the actions of two separate people sharing a space. They were the threads of a single, shared life. One morning, she took the ragged, filthy dress she had worn at the station, the one she had kept folded in a corner of her room like a bad memory. She carried it outside to the fire pit. Elias was nearby, splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat. He stopped when he saw what she held. She did not say a word. She dropped the dress onto the cold ashes. He watched her for a moment, then went into the cabin. He came back with a lit splinter from the hearth and handed it to her. She took it, the tiny flame trembling in her hand, and touched it to the frayed cloth. The fabric caught, smoldering at first, then bursting into a bright, clean flame. They stood together and watched it burn, watched the ugliness and the humiliation and the fear turn to black ash and smoke that the wind carried away across the plains. A fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. When it was done, he turned to her. "Sarah had a trunk," he said. "In the barn." He led her to the leaning barn, the air inside cool and smelling of hay and dust. In a shadowed corner sat a small cedar chest. It was not locked. He lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, were a few simple dresses, made of sturdy cotton and soft wool. They smelled faintly of dried lavender and thyme. She would have wanted you to have them, he said quietly. Lena reached out and touched the soft fabric of a plain, blue dress. It was not a gift of charity. It was an inheritance. It was a story being passed from one woman to another, a legacy of quiet strength and resilience. She was no longer a stray. She was the keeper of a garden, the wearer of a blue dress. She had a name. That evening, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, he spoke her name again. Lena, she looked at him. He was holding the small wooden bird with the broken wing, the one from her burlap sack. He had mended it. He had carved a new wing from a scrap of pale wood, attaching it so carefully the seam was almost invisible. He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, new wing. It was whole again, just like her. A slow, grateful smile touched her lips, the first real smile he had ever seen on her face. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, hard winter. In that quiet moment, sitting on the porch of the house he had built, with the mended bird in her hands, she knew she was home. It wasn't a place you found on a map. It was a place you built, stitch by stitch, meal by meal, word by word, out of the broken pieces of a life. It was the safety in a man's quiet presence, the warmth of a shared fire, the silent promise that you would never have to wait alone at the station again. This story, you see, it isn't just about rescue. It's about recognition. It's about seeing the humanity in someone everyone else has thrown away, and having the courage to stoop and pick it up. It's about the quiet, stubborn power of two broken people who, instead of demanding to be fixed, simply stand together and decide to be whole. We all have a name waiting to be spoken. Sometimes we are the ones who must find the courage to say it for the first time. Sometimes we are the ones who must be brave enough to hear it when it is whispered in a quiet place. And if you are very brave and very patient, you might just find that the things you build in the silence, a mended bird, a tended garden, a shared look across a fire, are the things that will finally, truly last. They are the things that make a house a home. They are the things that give us back ourselves.